Malaysian 370, contact Ho Chi Minh 120.9. Good night.
Good night, Malaysian 370.
And nothing would be found until more than 16 months later, when a discovery was made on the opposite side of the Indian Ocean. On the 29th of July 2015, a group of people were cleaning up a beach in Reunion, a small island to the east of Madagascar, when they stumbled upon this 2-meter-long metallic object covered in barnacles. Aviation experts quickly identified the object as a section of an aircraft wing known as a flaperon. Upon closer inspection, internal markings including dates and serial numbers conclusively ascertained the flaperon belonged to Flight 370. Even though Reunion Island is some 4,000 kilometers west of the search area, and more than a year had gone by since the flight disappeared, the location was consistent with simulations of debris dispersal patterns. There was now tangible evidence that Flight 370 had crashed somewhere in the Indian Ocean. The discovery of the flaperon prompted numerous searches along beaches and shorelines of southeastern Africa, and at least 31 additional items of interest have since been recovered and examined. Some of these items include a section of the outboard flap from the right wing, a piece of cowling from one of the two engines, a partial door from the nose landing gear, a section of the vertical stabilizer, and a mangled casing from one of the embedded headrest monitors. 18 of these items were identified as either likely, highly likely, or almost certain to have originated from Flight 370, whereas only 3 could be confirmed. The remaining 11 could not be identified. There were no traces of an explosion found on any of the debris tested, nor was there any evidence of a fire except for 3 small burn marks on one of the unidentifiable items. The search for debris was further aided by Earth observation satellites. Analyses of satellite imagery from March of 2014 uncovered a number of images which appeared to feature man-made objects floating on or just below the surface in the southern Indian Ocean. However, the images were not nearly sharp enough to resolve any identifiable markings, and multiple searches notwithstanding, this debris was never recovered. A satellite image taken mere hours after the final transmission also captured what appeared to be a contrail some distance away from the search area. A later analysis, however, concluded it was most likely a shadow from a somewhat linear cloud formation. The underwater portion of the search continued for months and eventually years before it was finally suspended in early 2017, by which point some 120,000 square kilometers of seabed had been scrutinized. The search effort was then resumed by an American salvage company known as Ocean Infinity, but after more than a year of searching, they too came up empty-handed. Unless the final resting place of Flight 370 can be located, it may be impossible to determine exactly why it crashed. Nevertheless, there have been no shortage of theories. On the day of the disappearance, 2 of the passengers raised suspicion as they had boarded the flight with stolen passports, which immediately prompted concerns of a hijacking. But investigators were unable to link the 2 men to any terrorist organizations, and soon determined they had traveled under false identities because they were seeking asylum, not due to any nefarious intent. Similar suspicions were raised when one of the passengers were identified as a flight engineer, who might have possessed the necessary expertise to take control of a Boeing 777. Apart from the 239 persons on board, Flight 370 carried nearly 11 metric tons of cargo. Among the items listed on the flight manifest was a shipment of lithium-ion batteries, which led some to suspect a fire might have broken out mid-flight. For instance, the crash of UPS Airlines Flight 6 in September of 2010 was the result of a fire that was ignited by a pallet of lithium-ion batteries. Another potential source of ignition would be an electrical malfunction. The crash of Swiss Air Flight 111 in September of 1998 is thought to have been caused by a fire within the electrical wiring above the cockpit. The fire damaged and disabled multiple avionics systems, including the transponders and SATCOM. In the case of Flight 370, the sudden loss of communication and subsequent deviation from its scheduled flight path might have been a direct response to a fire. The 2 pilots may have turned back towards Malaysia to attempt an emergency landing at the nearest suitable airport. But no such attempt was ever made. Instead, Flight 370 kept going and remained aloft for another 6 hours. Some have theorized the crew might have been incapacitated by a sudden or gradual loss of cabin pressure. For instance, when Helios Airways Flight 522 failed to pressurize in August of 2005, the pilots quickly fell unconscious. Yet the aircraft continued to fly on autopilot for more than 2 hours until it ran out of fuel. Airline pilots are of course trained for such an event. In the event of cabin depressurization, an automatic system is designed to deploy oxygen masks to give the pilots enough time to perform an emergency descent to a more breathable altitude. The data recorded by the Malaysian military radar does indeed contain altitude information, but it is highly inconsistent. In fact, the Boeing 777 is incapable of performing the extreme altitude fluctuations recorded. At one point, the aircraft exceeded its maximum operating altitude by more than 15,000 feet before making a 50,000 feet nosedive in less than a minute. Attempts to recreate these maneuvers on a flight simulator were unsuccessful, and thus the data was deemed inaccurate and unreliable. If Flight 370 did lose cabin pressure at 35,000 feet, and the pilots were incapacitated before descending to a more oxygenated altitude, it might explain why the aircraft remained aloft for as long as it did. What is a bit more difficult to explain, however, are these alterations in heading. Flight simulations have established the aircraft must have been under manual control during the initial left turn, as the bank angle or inclination of that turn was beyond the limits of the autopilot. Subsequent turns, however, could have been either manual or automatic. But for the autopilot to have made these course corrections, someone with the requisite knowledge must have programmed it to do so. The only other alternative is that the aircraft was in fact under manual control.
Mày không hớt được đâu con trai, tôi bi không tình yêu.